I could see the black discs moving swiftly, but not at great altitude, passing among the night clouds under the 3 moons of Gore. I and Kernus and Ho Tu and others stood in the lonely darkness of a recessed ledge on a high peak in the Voltai, some parsangs northeast of Ar. The ledge was attainable only on Tarnback. There was no fire, no light. There were perhaps a dozen of us there. About an hour following the eerie cry we had heard in the hall, Ho Tu had arisen from the table and gestured for me to accompany him. I did so, and we climbed a long spiral staircase until we came to the roof of the house of Kernus. Though doubtless Ho Tu was well known to the guards at the Tarncot, he none the less showed them a small flat rectangle of glazed clay, white in colour, marked with the sign of the house of Kernus. On the roof we met Kernus and others. Some were Tarnsmen, others members of the house. On the roof there were 8 Tarns, beside 5 of which they were carrying baskets attached to Tarn harness. Kernus had looked at me.
"We did not specifically discuss your wages," he remarked.
"It is not necessary," I said. "It is well known the house of Kernus is generous." Kernus smiled.
"I like you, Killer," he said, "for you do not haggle, but you are silent. You keep your own counsel, and then you strike." I said nothing.
"I am much the same," said Kernus, and he nodded his head.
"You did well to sit at the high table."
"Who would dispute my place?" I asked.
Kernus laughed. "But not so high as I," he said.
"You are master of the house," I said.
"You will see," said Kernus, "that the house of Kernus is indeed generous, and more generous than you had thought to dream. You will come with us this night, and for the first time you will understand how great indeed is my house. You will this night understand how wisely you have invested the use of your sword."
"What will you show me?" I asked.
"Serve me well," said Kernus, "and in time I will make you the Uba of a city."
I looked at him startled.
Laughed Kernus. "So even the equanimity of an assassin can be shaken. Yes, the Uba of a city, and you may choose the city, any save Ar, on whose throne I, Kernus, will sit."
I said nothing.
"You think me mad," he said. "Of course, in your place I too should think such, but know that I am not mad."
"Oh, I do not believe you mad," I said.
"Good," said Kernus, indicating one of the Tarn baskets.
I swung myself into the basket, which I shared with 2 men-at-arms. Kernus and Ho Tu rode together in another basket. The Tarn basket may or may not have the guidance attachments permitted the Tarn to be controlled from the basket. If the guidance attachments are in place, then the Tarn is seldom saddled, but wears only basket harness. If the basket is merely carried, and the Tarn cannot be controlled from the basket, then the Tarn wears the Tarn saddle and is controlled by a Tarnsman. The basket of Kernus and my basket both had guidance attachments similar to those of the common Tarn saddle, a main basket ring corresponding to the main saddle ring, and 6 leather straps going to the throat strap rings. The other 3 baskets, however, had no control attachments, and those birds wore saddles and were guided by Tarnsmen. Tarn baskets, incidentally, in which I had never ridden before, are of many different sizes and varieties, depending on the function for which they are intended. Some, for example, are little more than flat cradles for carrying planking and such. Others are long and cylindrical, lined with fair skin, for transporting beverages and such. Most heavy hauling, of course, is done by Thalarian wagon. A common sort of town basket, of the sort in which I found myself, is a general utility basket, flat-bottomed, square-sided, about 4 feet deep, 4 feet wide, and 5 feet long. At a gesture from Cairnes the birds took wing, and I felt my basket, on its heavy leather runners, slide across the roof for a few feet, and then drop sickeningly off the edge of the cylinder, only to be jerked up short by the ropes, hover for a moment as the town fought the weight, and then began to sail smoothly behind the bird, its adjustments made, its mighty wings hurling the air contemptuously behind it. The spires of Ar, depending on the weather, can normally be seen quite clearly from the nearer ranges of the Voltai, or the Red Mountains, the greatest mountain range of known Gaur, superior to both those of Thentis and the Sarda itself. We flew perhaps an arn, and then, following a lead townsman, dipped one at a time, the others circling, and landed on a rocky shelf on the side of a steep cliff, apparently no different from dozens of others of such shelves we had already passed, save that this shelf, due to an overhang of the cliff above, tended to be somewhat more sheltered than most. Once landed, the towns and the baskets were moved back beneath the overhang, beneath which we took up our posts as well. No one talked. We stood there in the night, in the cold, for perhaps better than 2 arn. And then I heard one of the men-at-arms say, "There!" The black disk approached, more slowly now, seeming to sense its way. It dropped among the peaks, and moving delicately among the rocks, neared our shelf. "It's strange," whispered one of the men-at-arms, "strange that priest-kings must act with such secrecy." "Do not question the will of the priest-kings," said another. I was startled. About 100 yards from the shelf the ship stopped, stationary, more than 2,000 feet from the ground below. I saw Ho too, looking at the ship, marvelling. "I have seen it," he said, 100 times, "and yet each time it seems to me more strange. It is a ship, but it does not float on water. It floats in the sky. How can that be?" "It is the power of the priest-kings," whispered one of the men-at-arms. Cairnes now, from beneath his cloak, removed a small flat box, and with his finger pressed a button on the box. A tiny light on the box flashed red twice, and then green, and then red again. There was a moment's pause, and then from the ship there came an answering light, repeating the signal, except that the signal terminated with 2 reds. The men stirred uneasily, and then the ship began to ease toward the shelf, moving perhaps no more rapidly than a man might walk. Then, clearing the shelf by no more than 6 inches, it seemed to rest there, not actually touching the rock. The ship was disc-like, as are the ships of priest-kings, but it had observation apertures, which the ships of priest-kings lack. It was about 30 feet in diameter, about 18 feet in height. There was no evidence of the discharge of energy. Cairnes looked at me. "To speak of what you see is, of course, death," he said. A panel on the side of the black ship slid back, and a man's head appeared. I don't know what I expected to see, but I was greatly relieved. My hand was on the hilt of my sword, sweating. "The trip was uneventful, I trust," said Cairnes, putting the signal apparatus back in his robes. The man, who wore a simple dark tunic and sandals, dropped out to the ground. His hair was dark and clipped short, his face intelligent but hard. On his right cheek, over the cheekbone, was the thief brand of the caste of thieves of Port Car, who used the small brand to identify their members. "Look," said the man to Cairnes, leading him about the side of the ship, and there, in the side, was a great smeared wrinkle of erupted metal. "A patrol ship," said the man.
"You are fortunate," said Cairnes, and the man laughed. "Have you brought the apparatus?" said Cairnes.
"Yes," said the man. Few of the men on that rocky shelf reacted much to what was going on. I gathered they had seen this ship or others like it before, but they had little inkling of the nature of the events that were transpiring. Indeed, I suspect that other than Cairnes, there was none who truly understood the nature of the ship and its mission, and perhaps he only incompletely. I myself, from my conversation with Misk, probably suspected more of its role and purposes than any other on that shelf, with the exception of Cairnes himself.
"What do you think?" asked Cairnes, turning to me pleased.
"The power of the house of Cairnes is great indeed," I said, "greater than I had dreamt." And Cairnes laughed. The man from the ship, seemingly anxious to be on his way, had now returned to the interior of the ship. Inside I could see 4 or 5 others, clad much as he was, all human. They seemed apprehensive, nervous. Almost immediately the first man, he who wore the tiny thief's brand, returned to the panel, and crouching down held out a small, obviously heavy, box to Cairnes, who, in spite of the fact that he was master of the house of Cairnes, took it in his own hands. Cairnes returned to his carrying basket, holding the small box heavily before him. I motioned for Ho Tu to enter the basket, and the master keeper did so. He then received the box from Cairnes and placed it carefully in the basket. He spoke to one of the men-at-arms.
"Unload the cargo," he said.
And then, using the one strap on the basket ring, Cairnes signalled to the tarn. The bird stalked out from under the overhang, poised itself on the edge of the shelf, and then, with a leap and a beating of its wings, entered its element. I saw the basket containing Cairnes and Ho Tu flying towards R. I gathered that the main cargo, whatever it was, had already been unloaded, that it reposed in the small heavy box, and that it was now on the way to the house of Cairnes.
"Hurry!"
called the man with the thief's scar, and those of the staff of the house, including even the townsmen, stood lined before the panel and received various goods which they placed in the carrying baskets. I alone did not participate in this work. I did, however, observe it carefully. Certain of the boxes which were unloaded, to my surprise, bore lettering in various languages of earth. I recognized English and French and German, something that was presumably Arabic, and other boxes which were marked with characters doubtless either Chinese or Japanese. I suspected, however, that the goods in these boxes might not all be those of earth. I suspected rather that in some of these boxes at least might be goods from the ships of others, transported by way of earth in ships to be piloted by men. Some of the goods, however, were surely of earth. Among them was a high-powered rifle with telescopic sights. To possess such a weapon, of course, on Gore was a capital offence, it being a violation of the weapons war laws of the priest-kings.
"Oh, what is this?"
asked one of the men-at-arms.
"It's a crossbow," said the man with the thief's scar. "It shoots a tiny lead quarrel."
The man looked at it sceptically.
"Now, where is the bow and cord?" he asked.
"Inside the quarrel," said the man impatiently.
"It's in the powder. A spark hits the quarrel, and the powder cries out and flees, pushing the quarrel before it down this tube."
"Oh," said the man-at-arms. The man with the thief's scar laughed and turned to accept another box from a man deeper within the ship.
"Surely it's a forbidden weapon?"
said the man-at-arms.
"Not to priest-kings," said the man in the ship.
The man-at-arms shrugged and took the rifle, or crossbow as he thought of it, and surely the stock resembled that of a crossbow, and placed it in one of the carrying baskets. "Ah," said one of the townsmen, seeing the man on the ship hand out the first of several heavy squares of gold. I smiled to myself. This was the cargo the men on the shelf could understand. There was a large quantity of this gold, perhaps 40 squares, which were distributed among the 4 tarn baskets remaining on the ledge. It was, I assumed, earth gold. It was undoubtedly such gold which permitted the house of Cairnes to gain significant influence in the city, sponsoring races and games, as well as permitting the house to undersell, when it pleased, other merchants. "How many slaves?" asked one of the men-at-arms. 10, said the man with the thief's scar. I then watched while 10 cylindrical tubes, apparently of transparent plastic, were removed from the ship. Each were marked and sealed, but in each, at 2 points, there were valve openings, through which, in flight, I suppose, 2 tubes might pass, one perhaps for oxygen and another gas used to sedate the occupant, and one to draw the carbon dioxide from the cylinder. The valves were now open, permitting a bit of air to enter and leave the cylinders. Each cylinder contained a beautiful girl, unclothed and unconscious. About the left ankle of each there was locked a steel identification band. They were doubtless girls kidnapped on earth, brought to Gore to be slaves. With a wrench device, each of the cylinders was opened, and its occupants drawn forth by the hair and placed on the rocky shelf. The cylinders were then returned to the ship. One of the girls began to stir uneasily, perhaps sensing the difference in temperature and air. The man with the thief's scar again emerged from the ship, this time with a syringe. He injected a tiny bit of serum into each girl, entering the needle in the girl's back on the left side between the hip and the backbone, and passing the needle each time into a small vial he held in his left hand. The girl, who had been stirring uneasily, rolled about once, tossing her head to one side as though in fever, and then her movements subsided, and she lay quietly sedated. "I will not wake now," said the man with the thief's scar, "for better than an urn." One of the men-at-arms laughed. "When they do," he said, "they will find themselves in the slave kennels." Several of the others laughed. The man with the thief's scar then re-entered the ship, and the panel slid shut. There had been no bill of lading or receipts of any kind exchanged. I gathered that no such checking, common in legitimate exchanges, was felt desirable or necessary. The lives of these men, I supposed, was their bond. The girls had now been placed on their stomachs, and 2 townsmen, with short lengths of binding fibre, were fastening the ankles of each together, and binding the wrists of each behind her back. And then, because the baskets in which they were to be transported did not have covers, the girls were placed in pairs, head to feet. The throat of each in pair was tied to the ankles of the other, and this is a device used when transporting slaves in open baskets to prevent one from struggling to her feet and, in flight, throwing herself over the side of the basket. The precautions, however, considering that the girls were drugged, seemed to be unnecessary. On the other hand, these men were slavers, and not accustomed to taking chances with merchandise. I suppose it was possible that a girl might awaken in the rushing cold air and attempt to hurl herself to the ground. Elizabeth, I had learned, who had been shipped from the house of Clark, had been transported in a covered basket, lashed shut. This was more common. There had been 2 girls to each of the long sides in her basket, and one at each end. Their wrists had been tied behind them, a loop running through the heavy wicker to hold them in place. Their ankles had been tied together in the centre of the basket, and a further precaution, an independent one, was a long strip of leather looped several times around the throat of each and threaded through the wicker. Even if a girl should manage somehow, incredibly, because certain important knots are outside the wicker, to free herself, she would still be held in place by the loops on her throat. Gorean slavers, it might be mentioned, seldom lose prisoners. A girl enslaved on Gore has little prospect of escape. She is truly a slave, and is likely to remain so, unless, as happens upon occasion, she so pleases her master that he, perhaps against his better judgment, consents to free her. I felt sorry for the girls of earth. Their life would not be easy. Elizabeth Cardwell, I reminded myself, was of earth. Perhaps once, long ago, she had been brought, like these others, to Gore on the black ship of a slaver. I turned and observed the black disk, which had now silently lifted itself from the rocky ledge, and was moving horizontally away, vanishing among the peaks of the Voltae. "We return to the house of Cairnes," said the man-at-arms, and I and the others entered our baskets and mounted our tarns. In a moment the tarns left the rocky ledge, and in another moment or two, in the distance, I could see the lights of distant Ar.